Warning, this video contains spoilers for Yakuza 3, Kiwami 3, and Dark Ties, as well as minor spoilers for Yakuza 4, Yakuza 7 and 8, as well as Yakuza Gaiden, the man who erased his name.
どこを狙うかが狙いを決めてこんなところで止めちゃってどうだ
よし
Yakuza Kiwami 3 came out not too long ago, and I wanted to talk about it. There was a lot going on with this game prior to its launch, as well as discussions about the series' future that Kiwami 3 ultimately sets the tone for. Especially since, almost a month post-launch, that as of writing, Gang of a Dragon's development is in a bit of a weird spot that's left anyone interested in Yakuza, myself included, going a little stir-crazy. With not much else to do than share my 2 cents, I wanted to focus on Kiwami 3 as a game, with some light mentions of other entries like 7 and 8 here and there. I want to talk about the good, the bad, and shed some light on what the Kiwami 3 experience exactly is. This video isn't meant to be a review per se, rather me just rambling for a while on what's been 62 hours of my life as it took an effort to spend a lot of time completing this game. Things to note, when I say complete, I of course mean beat the main story of both Kiwami 3 and Dark Ties, do both of their campaign side quests, and any post-game nuggets like the fight against Ammon. If there's any additional completion awards and criteria beyond this, like having all the locker keys for instance, that's beyond my knowledge as I didn't make objectives like that a priority, given how that sort of thing typically isn't going to lead to any meaningful post-game content like secret bosses. Secondly, I won't be discussing the decision to recast legacy characters like Hamazaki in this video. There's plenty of other videos out there that dive deep into that topic at length by people who can and will give it its due course for those who want to know all about it. So bear with me when I say this video is to focus on the game solely as a game. Thirdly, I will be talking about Kiwami 3 and Dark Ties separately. I might mention Dark Ties once or twice here or there, but things unique to Dark Ties I'll save for further in. Fourthly, I'll be referring to the man who erased his name exclusively as Yakuza Gaiden, both for simplicity's sake, as well as potential foresight should any confusing naming conventions occur after this video goes up. And finally, in the making of this video, I have intentionally refrained from seeing other videos on Kiwami 3 purely for the sake of keeping my opinions as my own until this video is out. I'd rather know what I'm speaking on is what's interesting to me, without feeling as though I'm parroting the same talking points the rest of the internet has been doing over and over again. With all of that in mind, let's begin. On the surface, Yakuza Kiwami 3 is what I would call the monkey's paw of the series so far. Originally, I was in the crowd who went into 3 Remastered when that came out on Steam a couple of years ago with an open mind, and was left feeling as though there was something to be desired. Which I tend to find telling since Yakuza 3, regardless of someone expressing fondness or disdain for the game, both will say something to the effect of, "It hasn't aged the best, but," or "It hasn't aged the best, and." So to quickly run through my thought process here, Yakuza 3 was the one game I would repeatedly say back then that I wanted a Kiwami-style remaster of. I thought everything the game was trying to accomplish was great, but by the same time, it's the one mainline entry I simply don't enjoy long term. Like, I've played every game I can get my hands on since the series started coming to Steam, and I make an effort to do at least 2 runs for each game. Once on normal and do as much as I can before the credits roll, while I play the game naturally, and a second playthrough on Legendary where I go and do all the side quests on top of that. Yakuza 3 is the one entry where even though I was doing it and making progress through the game, I recall beating a certain boss, Lao Con Long, and being so irritated by the time I won that I put the game down and never went back, cause, to put simply, I wasn't having fun anymore. Fast forward 3 years later, and Kiwami 3 finally happens. It was time to jump from my seat and clap my hands like a giddy child as I thought, yes, now I can jump into this one to the fullest, this time for real! So I go and get the game at launch, and it's fine. I've certainly played worse. It hits the right beats, of course. The narrative is mostly intact, the CPU difficulty in minigames isn't absurd regardless of settings, but something's off, and this is something I'll come back to later. For now, let's focus on the combat. The series has been doing a lot to keep the original beat-em-up style gameplay alive, and I'm all for it. Granted, I'd be remiss to say I think every game feels just as good to play for one reason or another. Whereas 3 Remastered gave you an EXP and level system that you would invest your resources into 1 to 4 different meters at a time, Kiwami 3 instead adopts the money EXP system, where skills and moves are bought in an almost linear skill tree, where the further down you go, the more expensive items get. I don't mind this way of unlocking things, but I do wish it didn't feel quite so linear, especially when you have separate trees for your moves and abilities away from your attack and health, which are already separated into their own respective trees themselves. It tends to leave me in a position where I often find it easier to invest my in-game currency early on into exclusively attack and health upgrades after a couple of basic abilities like better sidesteps or the ability to regain block after it breaks. It results in me doing this until I'm far enough in the game to get larger quantities of cash to unlock all the actual moves in bulk, and everything quickly avalanches from there. Yakuza 0 had this system cracked to a science, and I'm a little confused how we reduced money EXP to this in just 11 years. Aside from that, you have the Miyazato Dojo that functions as a glorified type of challenge mode that predominantly pertains to the Ryukyu fighting style new to this version of the game. That's not to say the Dojima style doesn't have an unlock or two in there, but it's clearly not the main focus. You unlock the dojo relatively early on, which I'm thankful for, as neither fighting style really felt good to use right out the gate. Not only did the dojo do a good job of letting me practice and learn the Ryukyu style, the fact I was able to get rather far along in it despite how early in the story I was, it made the fighting style really good for early to mid-game, until I started to unlock some of the better options for dragging a Dojima further in. A quick side note while I'm making this video, something I'll say about the Ryukyu style is this. It doesn't feel like it was meant for boss fights. It feels as though it was intended purely for the Miyazato Dojo or the common enemy encounters you experience as you run about the towns. Moving right along to my next criticism of the combat, however, is the camera. I'm sure anyone watching this video can easily notice as I'm playing the game, the camera is constantly moving in weird directions that don't always seem to make sense every time I go to punch an enemy. None of that is me actually inputting it on the controller, rather the camera is just constantly spinning up its own record, because that's what it's designed to do. I really hope that they scale this back in future releases, if not just patch this outright, because it's very distracting that when you're fighting an enemy, the camera will turn around to face you while the enemy you're actually hitting isn't even on the screen. That's just one example, of course. There are plenty of other instances where the camera is constantly trying to maintain a certain angle, and as a result, the way you're smacking an enemy around, it will just keep spinning endlessly. I'm not really sure how we've gone from needing to control the camera manually ourselves to having to just constantly lock in on single enemies so we can actually line up our hits better. It's just strange. I feel like this is a good idea gone bad that, again, I know I just said it, I hope they scale this back, if not patch this out in the future. Something that I noticed was removed in this version of the game, relating to the combat loosely however, was the revelation system. I'll be honest, I never liked how this feature was used in Yakuza 3. I was fine with it in 4 and 5, since there weren't nearly as many revelations you needed to get per character. I think each one had one move tied to a revelation, whereas Yakuza 3 you had 10 in total for Kiryu. And before I get ahead of myself, let me rewind just a little bit. In the original Yakuza 3, there was an NPC named Mac. Mac would send you riddles to Kiryu's smartphone that you would have to deduce where in the hub world you needed to go, whether that be in Okinawa or Kamurocho. Once you made it to where the game wanted you to go, you needed to go into the first-person mode and focus in on the very specific thing that was happening that the game wanted you to find. Once you did this, you had to watch a series of animations that would prompt you to hit a series of quick-time events, and then you were prompted to select one of 3 different prompts on Kiryu's cell phone to supposedly post on social media under a time limit. If you did all of that correctly as the game wanted you to, you would then be rewarded with a new move that you could add to your arsenal. If you messed up any of the QTEs or selected the wrong prompt at the end, you would then fail and have to leave and come back in order to repeat the process over again. And at the same time, you couldn't progress to a different revelation if you hadn't done the one you already had. Meaning, say you were stuck at the 3rd one and really stumped and wanted to find it without resorting to the internet, you had to find that one before you could progress to the remaining 7. While all this is a cool idea, even with the animations themselves being silly enough to be their own reward, the way you were given these vague clues, having to do QTEs, and then pick the one of 3 prompts under a time limit, any of which could feel just as valid if I'm being honest, only one of those 3 would be the right answer, and then repeat that over and over again if you pick the wrong ones, it made what would have otherwise been a neat sub-story to do on the side into a tedious fetch quest to get a series of moves, some of which felt a little too important to be locked behind this. I had heard a lot of people express their ire over this before the game came out, and while I can see where they're coming from, I just don't quite feel like this is the biggest loss. Heck, that brings me to my next point with the weapon crafting system being removed this time around. I know that was a core part of the original Yakuza 3, but I don't know. When the combat was altered so heavily, I don't see its removal as a bad thing inherently. Especially when the Ryuku style feels like it's trying to be a bit of a middle ground response, oddly enough. That's not grounded in anything as fact, that's just what I thought when using it myself. Like, I can understand a lot more why people are disappointed that this was removed in particular, but for me personally, even in Yakuza games where weapons are done really well, I just don't use them unless I'm feeling lazy. And I'm referring to bringing your own into combat, not like the benches or potted plants and fire extinguishers that you see in the hallways during story segments. And since I'm still on the topic of things that got cut, let's talk about those sub-stories a bit. I'm 50-50 on this one. Most of what was cut is really whatever. I remember there was only one early on in 3 Remastered that didn't make a lot of sense since it was clearly a running gag that isn't even in Kiwami 1 or 2, so unless you played the original duology of games, it's like watching the third act of a comedy without any of the build-up. Sure, you might still laugh at the punchline, but its impact just isn't what it's intended to be. For those of you watching who played 3 Remastered, you'll know which one I'm talking about. If I recall correctly, it's one that you have to play in order to progress in the main story for some reason. Outside of that, Yakuza 3 always had stuff removed depending on what region you were playing the game from, but things had also been changed again for the remastered version. So as far as sub-stories go, while they were always kind of a mess before, I do understand the criticism over very specific ones that felt a bit more involved. Especially the one where you reunite Rikia with his childhood friend. Which, weirdly enough, I remember seeing videos on YouTube a couple years ago complaining about how unnecessary that one is, given how it's presented to you maybe 5 minutes before Rikia gets off in the story. And that's not to say anything about the sub-stories that were tied to minigames that aren't even in Kiwami 3. So their removal at least makes some level of sense, even if it's not the most satisfying reason. It's one nonetheless. That also brings me to my next talking point. Minigames. Let's talk about those minigames. The minigames for Kiwami 3 are certainly an upgrade, though the ones that the game encourages you to play a lot of do leave something to be desired. To quickly note, while I know some were cut this time around, the only ones I truly noticed missing was the Hostess Club thing. I say thing rather than what it really was, since, I won't lie to you here, I played it maybe once in 3 Remastered because the game makes you do it, and I never went back to it for either of my runs. Heck, it wasn't until I was well into the writing of the script that I even remembered the minigame that lets you refight bosses had been cut. I feel like that goes to show just how inconsequential some of this stuff was, but I can understand why someone would take issue with that. And I am genuinely impressed with myself for forgetting that until now, since I did spend some time with it as opposed to the Hostess Club. But otherwise, what's here is serviceable. Outside your standard games like darts, billiards, mahjong, etc., we now have a deeper cut of classic Sega games, some of which I'd never even heard of before. Emergency Call Ambulance, Slash Out, and Magical Truck Adventure are the new ones in my eyes, as we do still have a couple of mainstays that we've seen before, like Virtua Fighter 2, Fighting Vipers, and Motor Raid. I'm surprised with the sheer quantity of games here, as I've gotten used to maybe 2 3D games and then something like Outrun or Fantasy Zone servicing as the 2D game. It was to the point that this was the first time in a couple years I've stopped and played some of these all the way through, due to just how obscure I thought some of these were, and I was curious to learn more about them. It doesn't end there, as now we also have Game Gear titles this time around. Lost Judgment, Gaiden, and Pirate Yakuza had previously given us Master System games as an additional bit of content. And I love this kind of thing, like, I'll be so for real with you guys. As there really hasn't been a consistent way to play a lot of these in recent years, it does somewhat intrigue me how Phantasy Star 1 is yet to be included in this lineup, but I'll digress as I'm getting off topic. Kiwami 3 has Game Gear games to stand out, and that's what's important here. Not only that, some of these games also support 2-player, so for anyone hoping to play the Game Gear version of Pac-Man for some reason, your time is now. This lineup of Game Gear titles is genuinely impressive, and I do think the Namco games like Pac-Man and Galaga, for instance, certainly help. I stopped dead in my tracks upon seeing the Game Gear, as that was something I somehow kept forgetting about in the marketing campaigns building up to Kiwami 3's launch, because despite the fact they constantly harped on it from what I'm realizing, I'm absolutely the guy who spends time with this kind of stuff thanks to the Yakuza series, so I'm just like, how did I forget this? I genuinely don't know, because my reaction to seeing it, I'm like, oh, what's this? A Game Gear? Egads! You know. Not only that, to my knowledge, I'm pretty sure this is the only way you can play a lot of these on modern machines, so if you're particularly in the mood for something like Sonic Chaos or Shinobi Game Gear, welcome home. But enough about that, let's get back to the main minigames that the game pushes you to play. Yakuza 0 had the Cabaret Club Management, Yakuza 7 had a Rock Paper Scissors Shareholders Meeting minigame, and Kiwami 2 had a Tower Defense Construction Company game for Majima. It's all in good fun. For Kiwami 3, we got another Dynasty Warriors type of minigame called Bad Boy Dragon. I wanted to like this much more than I did, but I'm starting to like this as a minigame less and less with each game. Gaiden had Hell Team Rumble, Pirate Yakuza had the Madlantis Arena, and both of those I was okay with for different reasons. Gaiden was just a very short game that needed something to extend playtime and give you a feeling of getting the most out of the combat that game had to offer. Pirate Yakuza had the whole pirate motif going on where you assembled a crew and everything, so it made thematical sense, even if the minigame was just kind of button mashy and simple. Bad Boy Dragon? After the first 30 minutes with it, you've effectively seen 95% of what that mode has to offer. When you first enter the game mode, you're of course incentivized to run around town recruiting people to your cause. This is kind of fun as you find characters that'll join you depending on what rank you already have, as well as having to fight enemies around town in order to recruit special units. That sounds fun, except it's over almost immediately as there really aren't that many of those to do. So this part of the minigame is virtually over after you get the handful of characters that I want you to find. After you have your desired units, you then form multiple teams to take on an onslaught of enemies, take all their bases, and then give a final push to the finish as you have to beat the bosses armed with their entire teams behind them. In practice, this could be a very cool mode, but it's done in a very drawn out and repetitive way that outside of recruiting those new members, it's just a wall of enemies on the same two maps over and over again. You got the main map that has 8 bases, with narrow corridors in between to make traversal easier, and the tried and true open square room. This really could have benefited from some map variety as I quickly lost interest, since this is a mode you're meant to come back to over and over again as you play through the entire game. I got what I thought to what was the end, only for the second half of its story to kick off, and then I just kinda let out a groan as I kinda wanted to be done with it by that point. It wants so bad to have your attention, but after you're introduced to it, it just becomes busy work and overstays its welcome, and I wish I had nicer things to say about it. There could have been, I don't know, other map layouts. There could have been better weapons to call upon to use to add little effects to the game. There could have been unique maps with limits and unique hazards causing you to go out of your way to mix up your team assembly, and it just doesn't make those ideas matter. Team build limits boil into removing a certain type of teammate as an optional challenge for that mission. That's it. Traps? There were a couple that had like fire or lightning raining down at you, but they all came at the same pattern over and over again, made worse by it all being on the exact same map. So there really wasn't variety. It's either, oh, here's L-shaped pattern of fire falling from the sky in this hallway. Okay, now it's an upside down L-shaped thing of, fire or lightning in that same hallway. Okay, this mission it was fire, okay, this mission it's lightning, just over and over again. But while Bad Boy Dragon was a bit of a disappointment, on the upside is that the other mainstay is the Morning Glory mode, and this mode is so much better. This mode serves as a side story in of itself. In the main story of the original Yakuza 3, the player spent a fair amount of time at the beginning of the game being a foster father to Kiryu's many adopted children. It was a good character building moment for Kiryu as a person, and made for a nice change of pace away from the constant action of the prior games. In Kiwami 3, however, they took the interesting approach to take all of those segments and rework them into optional content. Now, you get to spend an even amount of time with each of Kiryu's kids and play mini-games that, at the same time, earn you materials and items for your adventure. While it's fairly time-consuming to see what all this mode has to offer, it at least has enough variety there to keep me invested, both between its mini-games and its story. One second you're playing a bug-catching minigame in the vein of something like Hungry Hungry Hippos, the next you're playing a pseudo-racing game as you sew a number of fabric goodies while staying within the line. There's a few more than that, however, but I can say I enjoyed all of these quite a lot. I'm hoping these minigames are further used in an inevitable Yakuza 9 should the Dodonko Island mode make a return. Lastly, there's Purgatory's Arena making a return from Kiwami 1 and 2. It does the job and doesn't overwhelm you, as you have a set amount of fights with slightly altering arena layouts. Interestingly, this is the mode that has the Joe Ammon fight attached to it, unlike other games where you have to beat all the sub-stories in order to find. Minigames and side stories alike usually give you what I'll make my next point about. how equipment is implemented. Depending on the game, equipment applies various buffs and bonuses as things change. In the case of Kiwami 3, that's been changed to a cell phone, and all of its many accessories. You can of course change the visual elements of Kiryu's cell phone without having to worry about the stats, of course. However, things like your antenna, your phone screen artwork, and the wrist strap charms provide you with the buffs that you tend to expect. Honestly, I like how this is presented to the player quite a bit. It's a cute way to keep things familiar without necessarily needing to reinvent the entire system. Granted, there are moments I felt unincentivized to mix up what I had equipped due to certain accessories and phone screens outweighing many of the options in the long run. It's a fun idea, and I'd like to see another system like this in the future if the team at RGG can think of another way to mix up the visual elements of the player's equipment. Now that we've touched up on everything else, it's finally time to get to the game's story. I know I already said it at the beginning of this video, but for anyone who didn't listen, now's your last chance to avoid spoilers. To me, for about 95% of the way, it does the job. After the game's intro, you're already in Okinawa, and the Morning Glory part of the story is made optional for side content, speeding up pacing of the early game story exponentially. Otherwise, it's largely the same. However, I cannot say the same about the game's ending that throws a wrench into everything, and I can't overlook that. Previously, I had been saying I wanted a Kiwami 3 purely for gameplay reasons. Thoughts of a Kiwami 4 popped into my head, but I always thought it was kind of unnecessary, as Yakuza 4 still holds up decently. However, the fact that Kiwami 3 completely alters the ending now makes it a necessity in order to explain the inconsistencies in the plot. So let's recap here. Hamazaki is supposed to run up on Kiryu and get arrested off screen, so he can later appear in the Okinawa Penitentiary and meet Saejima in Yakuza 4, and ultimately meet his end not long after. But now, not only does Mine survive his 25 to 30 some odd floor fall, he also stops Hamazaki from trying to get vengeance on Kiryu, thus he never gets arrested, and as of writing, doesn't get sent to prison. Had this been the original ending of Yakuza 3 all along, I nor anyone else probably would have minded this change. But given how now basically all but 2 major characters have had their deaths retconned to keep them alive, I'm besides myself here. I know they're clearly trying to set up a follow-up for Gaiden, but I have to ask, at what cost, you know? I feel even with what the story Gaiden had started with, you could have done enough with original characters and continue things naturally. Not retroactively retcon several character deaths over the last 2 mainline entries. Kashiwagi? Fine. It's ridiculous, but okay. Mine? I guess. I would have rather they started with him personally of all the retcons if that was the plan since Yakuza 7, but I'll digress. Andre Richardson? No. While I like how they portrayed him in Yakuza 8, that one feels like they were already flying too close to the sun. Lau Ka Long? Definitely not. By the time all this had started, I was one of those guys who got into Yakuza as it hit Steam and had played through 0 through Kiwami 2, and had to reluctantly dive straight into Yakuza 7 before getting to add Yakuza 3 to 6 to my library the following year. When I saw Lau Ka Long, I didn't even recognize him and thought maybe he was a different character altogether. When I finally realized that's who he was, and then played Yakuza 3 after the fact, the entire plot point soured. Here's Kashiwagi getting lit up like a Christmas tree. It's not the most believable story, but fine. Falling off a building and never showing the landing with Mine? You're pushing it. Doing it again with Andre Richardson? Alright, buddy. But then taking a piece of lead to the temple like it's the bite of 87? Just no. It's so confusing and weird at this point that I half expect a Kiwami 4 to come out with a side mode that has Mine and friends from Retcon Land going on an adventure as every character who got dropped from the writing of the future game suddenly returns, like the Florist or Tanamura, thus adding an explanation of why Tanamura didn't answer the phone call when Kiryu called him up at the end of Yakuza 5 to fight Amon, but for the sake of pacing, I'll have to digress once again. If the ending had stayed consistent, and saved any retcons exclusively for Dark Ties, I might have still grumbled, but at least the mental gymnastics I'd have envisioned to explain all this would have been a little easier to swallow. At the very least, I'm glad Nishiki didn't get retconned. I'd been hearing rumors before the game was finished that this was going to happen, but as of writing, let me emphasize, as of currently writing in the year 2026, that hasn't happened yet. Like, the sigh of relief I felt not seeing him stroll in like it was nothing was insane. Lastly, just to quickly mention, after the fight with Amon, they make an effort to have Kiryu say that he explicitly doesn't kill anyone, like that's always been a moral code of his. Which, while I want to say this is in line with his character, we've had moments before, like in Yakuza 5, where Kiryu points out it's more so out of it not being a necessity in the moment, but he'll most certainly do it as a last resort if he really needed to. and that just scratches the surface before talking about things like using guys as human shields in self-defense in Kiwami 1. This was probably the least of my concerns in the writing overall, but I just wanted to highlight that as my little qualm to stew over. Like, for all I know, they've probably patched out this dialogue, as there's already been updates that have quote-unquote improved text subtitles and localization issues. Whatever that means. With Kiwami 3 now summed up nicely, we can go into the truly new stuff. Dark Ties is a prequel story as to how Mine came to join the Tojo clan and find himself aligning his cause with Kanda. To put it simply, I like this mode. Even with its shorter than expected runtime, I didn't need to do this too much. I'll touch up on the story first and go into everything else afterwards. Its story can be summed up as follows. Mine, having failed to make any emotional connections thus far in life, is voted out of his own IT company. In a stroke of luck while in Kamurocho one night, he finds himself witnessing violence between rival Yakuza factions as he sees Daigo and Dojima fighting for his life as his men are willingly sacrificing themselves for his safety. Something about this display of loyalty strikes a chord with Mine as he then hires a private investigator, no not that one, to learn more. From there, he aligns himself with Kanda, who was just released from prison, and prevents him from wandering back inside within 12 hours. Over the course of Mine's planning and Kanda's low but albeit established reputation, the two climb the ranks of power within the Tojo clan. Mine gets to know Daigo a bit, and Kanda eventually leaves Mine for dead, following a sabotage plot by a disgruntled figure. Daigo runs out to save Mine out of concern, and after the two manage to save each other from an untimely end, Mine and Daigo form a close bond. Daigo then grants Mine his own clan, while Kanda ignorantly misunderstands his place in everything. We fast forward towards the climax of Yakuza 3, as we see Mine stop by a bar he and Daigo would regular at. Mine learns the place is shutting down, among other things, before telling the barkeep to hang on to a special bottle that they were trying to pass off onto him as a parting gift. We then fast forward to a first-person perspective of Kiryu confronting Mine atop the hospital, before then jumping sometime later as Daigo makes his way to the same bar despite his own schedule. He learns because of Mine, the place will remain open, and Daigo finally has some time to process his own grief before we then see Mine disguised outside of a building, claiming he's now a man who erased his name. The end. It's not a bad story at all. In fact, I enjoy quite a lot. Its problem simply comes from being heavily attached to the aforementioned retcons and the like. Maybe had Mine always survived, this wouldn't be a big deal. Maybe had the ending of Kiwami 3 not deviated so heavily and left all the new stuff exclusively in the hands of Dark Ties, I wouldn't care. But on its own, I'll still give it props for covering a lot of ground with roughly 2.5 hours of total cutscenes. I didn't feel like the pacing was off, I didn't feel like the interactions or relationships forming between characters felt rushed, it just worked really well. Albeit, showing Mine survives the ending of Kiwami 3 keeps this from feeling like an open-shut story, but I'll move on. The gameplay is good. The thing is, even with the unique playstyle and abilities, after finishing everything in Kiwami 3 by this point, a lot of the charm did begin to wear thin. In fact, I think that's why I'm glad it was kept short if you only played it for the story. Something to point out as a personal nitpick, you have to re-unlock CDs and Game Gear games in Dark Ties for some reason. I get why you'd expect to unlock these things if you played Dark Ties first, but I do wish there was some kind of flag in the code that would recognize if you had these things already and wouldn't need to go through the process of obtaining them again. Otherwise, your main seller here is the Hell's Arena mode. This has both a small tournament mode like Purgatory does in the main game, as well as Hell's Arena itself, which serves as a type of dungeon crawler. I preferred this a lot more than Bad Boy Dragon, and I really felt like this is what Bad Boy Dragon should have been doing from the outset. But even with that praise, I started to rush through it after being at least 50 hours deep by that point. It still suffers from some variety issues, but they don't feel as egregious as Bad Boy Dragon's. The conclusion also felt a little anticlimactic, as the minigame itself felt harder than the boss fight at the end of it all. I feel like this mode should have had a tongue-in-cheek endgame boss for me that could have had some kind of fan service tied to it. And as another side note, a bit of a nitpick of course, this mode did make me start to dislike the constant use of dungeons in recent games, relying on the sewer aesthetic to make believable labyrinths for the player that exists within the game world. Even when not every map is the same, much like Bad Boy Dragon felt, if they all share the same theme, things will inevitably blur together. I'm hoping RGG will exercise a little creativity here, but time will tell. Next, despite there being so many cut sub-stories in Kiwami 3, we did get a dozen or so new ones in Dark Ties. These aren't anything crazy, and there isn't a prize for doing them all, but they're simple enough to give us more of a look into Mine's personality when he isn't constantly having to remind people he isn't a pushover. These are presented to you in the form of something called Kanda Damage Control, which initially, you would think this would be a minigame on its own like the Majima Construction minigame in Kiwami 2, however, really this is where Mine gets his completion list from, as well as his sub-stories. Essentially, it's an all-in-one stop for all of your side content. I don't dislike it, but I do question what the purpose is of needing to manually select every side story from this very specific menu individually when you unlock them all by progressing in the main story anyways, instead of just being able to find them out in the game world as they open up to you. With that said, I think I've covered everything. I don't see this as me doing a proper review of the game, so I won't give it a score rating. But I would like to say that as a video game, I do think Kiwami 3 has some legs to stand on, just not the best ones. I think that's a valid enough reason to call attention to it and put my thoughts out there on the internet. If you love something enough, you're willing to criticize it from a good place, and I think I've accomplished that here. Heck, I'm not even expecting this video to pop off. If my thoughts towards Kiwami 3 resonate with you, cool. If not, that's fine. We're all our own people after all. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching this all the way to the end, just listening to me ramble about the stories of men in funny suits. If you like this type of thing, like and subscribe as you always would, and I'll see you around in another video. Till then, everybody.